I feel very fortunate that I was able to do the only thing I've ever wanted to do since I was 10 years old, and that is to fly in space. I also feel fortunate that for 38 years I was working in dangerous businesses and I absolutely loved it. But it's not the danger that I like. In fact, I don't like the feeling of adrenaline. I like to be in control, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. How do you control a situation? I'll draw a couple of distinctions here in a minute regarding managing risk, which is what most companies do really well. I'm sure your companies manage risk very well. But think about the workforce. When they pick up the toolbox and they go to work, they're not managing risk, they are now controlling risk. And I'll show you the differences between the two concepts. When I graduated college, I didn't want to get a real job, so I decided to join the US Navy and learn how to fly. This is a picture of the USS Forrestal in the final left-hand turn coming around for a landing. I knew the organization was going to give me the proper, those of you in training understand the KSAs, the proper knowledge, skill, and mental attitude to do any role really well. I knew the organization was interested in my survival, and so they and I were partners in my survival, but I held 51% of the corporate vote, and I didn't think they were going to give me enough knowledge and enough skill to do this job. I had no previous flight experience when I joined the Navy, so I became friends with the night shift janitor in the simulator building, and he would allow me to sneak in at night about 1:30 in the morning for 2 weeks straight, and I flew the simulator and got really good in it before I ever flew a Navy jet the first time. That has stuck with me throughout my career. The more preparation you do in a dangerous business, the more likely you will survive. They didn't actively help us with mental attitude. There were no dedicated training courses to help us with mental attitude, but I'll tell you, it's the most powerful and the most important of the three if you're operating in a dangerous business. I began to figure out the importance of mental attitude sort of on my own. I'll share with you two of the stories where I learned how important it is. It's the most difficult to teach, it's the most difficult to evaluate, but it is by far the most important for your workforce who are facing the hazards out in the workplace. This is a picture in the daytime coming around on a ship. This is what it looks like at night. And as a typical 24-year-old coming down the chute on a particularly dark and scary night one night, I was thinking to myself, this is really cool. I'm in the best job in the world. I'm really good at this job. I was thinking about my brother back in New York. He had an average job. He was a golf pro. But I had the best job. I had the best job on the planet. What I learned this night, it was a very dark, scary night, and the ship was moving around an awful lot. You could hear the voices of the other pilots going up several octaves on the radio, and I absolutely loved it because this is the kind of situation I like. What I learned that night is confidence is good, but overconfidence is deadly. When I should have been thinking about the proper things in the task, I was thinking about the wrong things, and I realized it a little bit too late. And about the time I crossed the ramp to a hard landing, I finally realized that, now, fortunately, I didn't damage any hardware. The only thing that was destroyed was my psyche, which was very well destroyed. They taxied me up to the darkest part of the flight deck, and I was shaken so badly I could not unstrap for about 10 minutes. And I told myself, you did this to yourself. The hazards are not always in the outside environment. Sometimes they're inside your helmet. And I sat there and I promised myself I would develop the mental skills and the techniques to concentrate when it's required. Sometimes it's not required, sometimes it is, and I'll talk about that here in a bit. The second time I learned, the second story that I want to share with you tonight, I learned about the importance of mental attitude all the way throughout my career, but the second experience that I want to share with you tonight is the night before my first launch attempt. When my head hit the pillow, I realized for the first time since I'd been an astronaut for 6 years that I've just now run out of time to get any smarter, and it's too late to quit. So I had to deal with that. I had to figure out, how am I going to get a good night's sleep and wake up tomorrow, climb on top of this rocket? You know, what if it starts coming apart? And I thought to myself, the first thought was, this is the only thing I've ever wanted to do since I was 10 years old. Helpful but insufficient, because I could still die tomorrow, and that's not what I wanted to do. So I thought a little bit harder about it, and it took about 20 minutes, and it finally occurred to me, and this has stuck with me from that night on. if bad things start happening tomorrow when I climb in this rocket and we start losing it, things go out of control, I'm going to spend my last seconds of life trying to save in priority order the crew, the vehicle, and the mission. Essentially, I was taking myself out of the equation. Doesn't matter what happens to me. If I can save the crew, I've done my job. I can die happy. That actually allowed me to go to sleep and get a good night's sleep and wake up the next morning, and then you focus on the job, you stay in the present, you concentrate, and you think about the crew. Doesn't matter what happens to me, it's about the humans. So I hope you take that back to your workforce. The human experience, if we're thinking about our buddies, how do I save my buddy? Then how do I save the hardware for the company? And then we can accomplish the mission. If I do it in that order, humans can achieve greatness if we're thinking about it in those terms. In 1998, my boss, who was running all of human spaceflight, a man by the name of George Abbey, recognized that the astronaut office was headed for trouble. We were starting to act a little bit unsafely, operate unsafely, and he asked me to take over and become the director of flight crew operations, the job that Deke Slayton first had when he was a Mercury astronaut, and he had some ear problems and became the director of flight crew ops. My boss gave me one command before I took the controls of 150 Type A rocket pilots, scientists, engineers, doctors, number one in their class, best at everything they've ever done. He gave me one command. He said, don't let them have an accident. So I had to figure out, well, first of all, how did we get into this situation where we're not, we have the best pilots in the world and we're not flying as safely as possible? So it occurred to us pretty quickly. I pulled together a team and we realized that in 1959, NASA hired from the cadre for astronauts, the first group of astronauts, the Mercury 7, from the cadre of military test pilots because they innately understood the principles of flight operations. We didn't have time to teach people the principles of operating excellence, and it worked very well for many years. When we began to fly in the space shuttle program, we had more and more doctors, scientists, engineers that came in as astronauts, great people, number one in their class, best at everything they've done, but they came with a different set of values and principles that helped them be successful. So the team looked at me and they said, you need to write down the principles of flight operations excellence. And we started from there, and I took the rest of the day, wrote down the 14 principles of operations, and from those principles, we began to develop the techniques of operating excellence. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, is some of the techniques that we developed on how to not only save lives, but be productive in the companies that you're all working in. One brief word chart. I mentioned the difference between managing risk and controlling risk. When a company manages risk, they use a notional calculation of likelihood times consequence. Very powerful tool that can help us prioritize effort, budget to reducing risk. If either the likelihood is too great or the consequence is too great, I can change that and reduce the risk. But think about it from the perspective of the worker. The worker picks up the toolbox and goes out to work. It's not a notional calculation. It is a real condition of hazards that they face. And those hazards are changing all the time. So that's the first significant difference. Both are valuable concepts, but think about it from the perspective of the worker when you go back to your offices. The second significant difference is the organization or the managers in the organization can change the mission or the system if the risk is deemed too high, but the worker doesn't have that option. The worker can recommend, frontline operator, the roustabout on the drill floor, can recommend changes, but it's up to the managers to change the system. They're constrained to, when I was a pilot, I had to take the airplane that was given to me. I couldn't say, no, that's a bad airplane. It has design deficiencies. The third big difference is, think about it, what happens after an accident? Typically, an investigation is completed, more rules, policies, and procedures come out, assuming the investigation team does a good job and they create some good corrective actions, and it generates rules. If you follow the rules, you'll prevent many accidents, but not all accidents. So what does the worker need in addition to rules? Turns out they need a set of principles and techniques. Quick illustration to illustrate the difference. Most companies have a rule that says you can't use a cell phone when you're driving on company time. Does everybody have that rule in their company? If you follow that rule and you don't use a cell phone when you're driving, you are able to prevent many accidents. But what if you wanted to prevent all accidents in your car? What's a better principle that you could follow? And I'll open it up to you. Anybody? Don't drive. I hear that often. It's probably the most common one I hear. You know, it's analogous to St. Thomas Aquinas, the safest ship is in the port or in the harbor. Well, you can't complete the mission. You can't go on the, get to the meeting that you're supposed to be going to or whatever. What if you want to complete the mission and you don't want to have an accident? Eliminate all distractions. So it's not just the cell phone. Maybe it's the conversation I'm having in the car. Maybe it's the song on the radio that I'm listening to, or thinking about the boss that is arrogant and has been yelling at me the last several days, or the meeting that I'm late for. All these, or the weather, or traffic, or other arrogant drivers. There's all kinds of distractions. If you can try to identify and avoid all distractions, now you have a principles-based technique that will help you prevent all accidents. So that's what I want to share with you. Keep following the rules, keep developing the rules, do that managing risk thing that you do so well in your companies. But this is something extra that I want to offer to you. If you can offer your workers, the frontline folks that are facing the hazards, a set of techniques to help them, they can not only prevent accidents, but they can be more productive and improve the bottom line of the corporation. Think back 50 years ago, last December, so 50 years in a couple of months. I thought this was really cool. I was in high school listening up in my bedroom and with my 9-volt transistor radio to this flight, the coolest flight ever, Apollo 8. For the first time in 4.5 billion year history, 3 men got up and left. And they went to a different celestial body off to the moon. Think about the audacity of the people making those decisions to send them off, to accept that risk, do things right, to send them off to a different planet. I'm going to cover a little bit later how they operate so flawlessly in space when it really matters. Think about going around the far side of the moon. There's 4 billion people on the planet at that time, 1968, Christmas Eve, 1968. 4 billion people there and 3 on this side, and you're out of radio communication. You have to do one burn to survive, called the lunar orbit insertion burn. Once you get to the moon, if you do nothing, you'll sling around and come back to the Earth, and hopefully that works and you can survive. But if the burn is too short, you're in orbit around the sun forever, and you run out of oxygen in about a week. If the burn is too long, you impact the surface of the moon. And if it's any other kind of anomaly that you have, you could end up in a perpetual orbit around the moon, where again, you run out of oxygen or food, et cetera, and you die. There's so many things in the space program that end with, and then you die. So how do we deal with that? Yes, you have the checklist to perform this burn flawlessly, but you're on your own. What if you make a mistake in that checklist? There is no one to help you. I'll talk about that here coming up. I also want to mention George Lowe on the left, who is the person responsible for making the decision to send 3 people to a different body, and Wernher von Braun, the designer, the leader of the rocket that took them to the moon. These 2 men, they still tell stories of their leadership skill 50 years later. That's what kind of leaders they were. And more about that later after dinner if you want to hear about that. So let me just go through as many techniques as I can until I run out of time. Here's the first one. It's called balance confidence with humility. The story is, this is a group of flight controllers and instructors that would help us to train for the mission, and then in the mission control that help us during the mission. As the director of flight car operations, I had a communications device in my office where I could listen to the debriefs of the crews as they're debriefing with the controllers and the instructors. And too often I would hear crews that reported to me blaming the controllers for mistakes that the controllers made. Worse, I heard some of the crews blaming controllers for mistakes that the crew made but you didn't help us enough. And I was frankly very embarrassed about this and sort of changed the rules, and we couldn't do that anymore. On the cruise that I commanded, we had a rule that said you could only look inward and blame ourselves, couldn't blame anyone else. Even if they made a mistake, we didn't help them solve the problem. The upside positive consequence for my cruise was, first of all, I was not embarrassed. That's about all I was trying to do. What I didn't realize, the positive unintended consequence, was how much they loved working with my crews. They would come earlier, the instructors and the controllers. They would stay later. They gave us more training. They helped us more. They took more than their share of the blame for problems that we had. It translated into flight operations that the last flight I flew, up until that point, we made the fewest mistakes of any crew I've ever seen or heard about at NASA, and this was mission 113 in the Space Shuttle program. But it wasn't because we had a really good crew. We did have a really good crew, but our crew was really 2,000 people because we had all the controllers and really contractors all around the country that could help us if we needed to with a problem. The point is, have the confidence to climb on a rocket or be working in a dangerous environment, but have the humility to recognize that I don't have all the answers and I need other people. I need to help other people and they can help me. Sometimes I ask for a show of hands. I won't do it tonight. Do you know anybody who shows an awful lot of confidence and shows insufficient humility? Because I think we all know people like that. It also translates into operations up on orbit or in your workforce. The most common question we ask ourselves as we're ready for the deorbit burn is not what a great ride or what a great mission or look at the view. The most common question we ask ourselves is, what latent errors have we input into the system that it's not too late for us to remove? What mistakes have we made that we can correct before it's too late? Constantly asking ourselves that question. Most of the time we didn't make a mistake, but sometimes we did and we were able to trap it. We encourage the ground folks to help us to correct errors that we made. We involve them all the time. So have the humility to expand your team of useful participants to not just your local team, but the wider organization. The next technique, this is a picture that I took of, I was flying the Lead A7. These are my two wingmen on the western coast of Sardinia way back last millennium, and got lucky with a good picture. We're down at 50 feet over the Mediterranean, had a nice wave breaking up below us, and then I was right back on the controls and flying. I used the picture to show that in this kind of an environment, you have to be aware of the hazards at all times, and you do have to multitask. But you really have to develop an ability to maintain awareness. So it turned into one of the most important techniques that we had, which is called develop and maintain risk awareness. Well, that's a bunch of words. What does that really mean? So I separated it into 3 sub-techniques to help me remember it. I think of the concepts of past, present, and future. In the past, it's called search for vulnerabilities. So the point is, there's no airplane, boat, lawnmower, automobile, anything I've ever driven or operated without fully trying to understand, how can this system kill me? I love Tim's questions, by the way, because now there's a lot more answers to that question in the future. How can this system kill me? There's a lot of ways that automated systems are going to have devious methods to hurt people. So search for vulnerabilities. How do I learn that? Well, I read the owner's manual. I talk to the corporate test pilot or the manufacturer or the design engineer or other operators. I certainly read accident reports to find out how has this system killed people in the past. So I'm doing an awful lot of research before I ever go and operate the system. As a test pilot, you learn this. You do a lot of work these days before you climb into a rocket or an airplane that's new or being tested. In the present, it's called maintain situational awareness. I'll show you a couple of examples about how you do that coming up. The most important one, which is also, again, the most difficult, it's almost that is the case always. The most important ones are the hardest ones to do. It's called anticipate the changing shape of risk, because as you use systems, even if you're using them in the intended operation, the risk profile is increasing, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a little bit. So the first example, search for vulnerabilities. Before I ever landed the space shuttle, the first time I learned from some of the experienced folks and the design engineers that the weakest part of the landing and rollout system were the brakes. Just didn't have enough energy storage capacity in the space shuttle. So I have the 2 longest landings in the history of the program. Why? Because I understood the vulnerability and I decided not to use the brakes. Upside positive consequence, I didn't blow the tires. and run out of control and go into the moat with the alligators. The unintended positive consequence, the ground crew responsible for changing the brakes and the tires after every flight came up to me and shook my hand and said, "Thank you very much. We don't have to change the brakes and the tires on your flight because you didn't use them." So understand the vulnerabilities and then do something, protect the system and allow it to protect you. A little closer to home, I used to live in a neighborhood down south of Houston here, and this was the only road going out of my neighborhood. You had to drive on this road, and if I understand the vulnerabilities, you know, there's a particular hazard of this 3,000-pound death machine coming towards me. What happens if he or she veers into my lane? Look at these concrete abutments all the way down the length of this road. There's 10 concrete abutments. I don't have a lot of options. So I'm maintaining awareness, particularly looking at the front tires of that car. I'm not thinking about the meeting I'm late for or my arrogant boss. I'm thinking that driver is going to try to kill me, and I give myself a split second of extra time to make a decision and do something about it. So I'm maintaining awareness. If you don't think it happens, often you see this, especially here in Houston, sorry to say. Can you identify the body language indications of somebody who is not maintaining awareness? On an aircraft carrier flight deck, there are hazards all around. And I maintain that you can, and I'll show you a picture of how to identify somebody who's not paying attention. Here's the story. When the airplane lands on the aircraft carrier, the hook grabs onto a 1-inch steel braided cable, pulls it out of hydraulic spools, and it slows the airplane down from 150 knots to 0 in about 2 seconds. It's great fun. Most of the time it works very well. Sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't, the cable snaps and it goes slinging down the flight deck, and it will cut you in half if you don't see it and jump over it. When I show you this next picture, see if you can identify the person who is not maintaining awareness of the hazard bearing down on him. So clearly that person in the dark shirt is not paying attention, and so the supervisor, immediate negative feedback, bam, upside the back of the head. Back in the day you were allowed to do that, and teach the person a different skill set of maintaining awareness all the time. Often I do these speeches on a stage just like this, and I'll be moving around and getting very close to the edge of the stage just to see all the safety professionals getting really worried. But I'll tell you that I'm always aware of the edge of the stage. I'm thinking about my words and I'm trying to gauge the audience reaction, but I'm always aware of where that hazard is because I've developed the ability to maintain awareness all the time. What leads to fatalities? I've already talked about one of them just now, which is complacency. Turns out when work is dangerous, but the workers are familiar with the work, they get complacent, and that's when they die. The second one is a little more interesting. When the work is difficult, but they are successful, so what's going on there? Well, they're taking shortcuts. So as a supervisor, go back to your workplace and see if you can find areas in your dangerous operations where the workers are being successful, and make sure they're doing it right and they're not just lucky. Make sure they're not taking shortcuts. The third one is, this may surprise you, if you're working in an organization that has a goal of 0 injuries, your risk of dying is increased. Why is that? It's not the goal. It is a noble goal. It's a good goal to have. I encourage you to have that goal. But what happens in those kinds of organizations, unless you're really careful, reporting is driven underground or goes down, and then your organization doesn't learn. So have the goal, but make sure you're getting out there and making sure that you're rewarding people for reporting and you're learning lessons, or they have an increased chance of dying. To help me remember, again, a lot of words, how do I remember that? Well, it's the same number 1, number 3, and number 4 in the managing risk process. They're not identifying the hazard, they get complacent, they're not implementing the proper controls, and they're not reporting, so the organization's not learning, just to help you out a little bit. I mentioned the most difficult or challenging one is anticipate the changing shape of risk. Here's a picture of the people gate at the Johnson Space Center. I used to run through this for 18 years trying to maintain cardiovascular fitness. There's a particular hazard here that I had not seen until I started teaching these courses to other pilots. I'll flip the camera around and ask you from a different perspective, and I'll ask you the question, where is that rusty spring going to go if it suddenly breaks? And the more important question is, when is it more likely to break? It's not going to be when no one's going through the gate and it's sitting there static. It's going to be because I'm using the gate in its intended operation that I'm scraping and adding risk, and that's when it snaps and hits me in the jugular or the eyes. So try to anticipate the changing shape of risk, even if I'm using systems normally. Same thing in the drilling platforms. So you've drilled the well, you've gone through the greatest part of the risk, and now you're producing the well for the next 20 years. Is the risk profile increasing? It sure is, because as I'm drawing hydrocarbons up from that reservoir, the chemical composition is changing. If I don't tweak the topside equipment, the risk profile is increasing, even if I'm doing things normally. Here's a group of folks that are not doing any one of the three. How about going through an intersection? Do I go through this intersection? Well, I understand the vulnerability of intersections. I can't maintain awareness in my low eye height car, so I don't go through this intersection until I creep up and make sure that somebody's not going to T-bone me by running the red light coming the other side. I'm anticipating that they're all trying to kill me out there, and to this day I've still not died in an intersection. I'll go through this relatively quickly. I only have about 4 minutes left. The next technique is called follow procedures and rules thoughtfully. We had a saying in the space program: there's only 2 ways to get in trouble with procedures: do not follow them, or to follow them blindly, because there may be errors in the procedure. Whose fault is it if there's an error in a procedure and the crew dies? Doesn't matter whose fault it is. Somebody died and the crew didn't catch or trap the error that was in the procedure. So you have to teach people to follow procedures thoughtfully. I don't have time to talk about how you do that, but there are techniques to help people with that. This is just a picture of people violating rules. The other point that I use the picture is, of all the rules, policy, or procedure you have in your organization, the ones people are the most tempted to violate are the safety rules. Think about why that is, and we can talk about that later if you want. Sometimes rules in your organizations are overly prescriptive. What does the worker do with that? Sometimes the rules in your organization are confusing or contradictory. Do they really know what to do if they have a question, or they don't understand, or there's 2 rules that seem to apply? In a space program, we don't just open a hatch, we follow the procedure. It's very apparent and obvious why we do that. And it's not just because there may be a hard vacuum on the other side and you suffocate and then you die. There may be toxic fumes on the other side of the hatch, but also you want to leave a hatch in a good configuration, ready to be closed in a moment's notice if you develop a leak. So it's the old watertight integrity principle on a ship. So you follow the procedure when you're opening the hatch. But I illustrate that for the next reason. You also follow the procedures for using the toilet in space. It's not so obvious how critical it is until I tell you that your butt is indirectly connected when you're using the toilet to the hard vacuum of space. You do not want to make a mistake in a valve on the space shuttle. One of the more powerful techniques is called identify trigger steps. This is probably the last story I'm going to do, and I'm going to jump, Josh, to the next slide, but I'll tell you when. We'll stick with this story as the last one. There's a conundrum that I didn't realize until I had been operating for a lot of years, and it goes like this. In a dangerous business, we're all humans. We know we can make a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. Operators make mistakes. Unfortunately, in a dangerous business, the smallest mistake can quickly cascade to disaster. So my crew and I are trying to figure out, as I'm getting ready to fly on my 6th mission, how do we handle that? How are we going to go up in space for 2 weeks and not make mistakes? Knowing that we're humans and we will make mistakes, how do we prevent them from cascading to disaster? And I asked around to other experienced crews, and nobody had a good answer. The best answer I heard was, you just got to concentrate 125% the whole time you're in space. And I thought to myself, I don't know what that means to concentrate 125%. I don't have that ability. I can't concentrate more than about 4 hours without getting fatigued. That doesn't work for me. And the crews are looking at me, how are we going to solve this problem where we cannot make mistakes or we might die, knowing that we're humans and we will make mistakes? So I went home and had a pretty sleepless night. Couldn't figure out the answer. I knew the crew was going to ask me the next morning, how are we going to handle this? Finally, about 4 in the morning, it occurred to me, you don't always have to concentrate, even in a dangerous business. You only have to concentrate when there's a consequence. So I have to really concentrate when I get to the edge of the stage. If I'm back here, it doesn't really matter. There's no risk here. There's a lot of risk right here. So I have to be able to identify which steps are important and critical and do something about it before I execute that step. Don't have time to talk about what you do, except for two quick stories to illustrate it. So I've flown 20 different kinds of airplanes in my career, and I always tried to do the checklist professionally, rigorously, without making mistakes. But maybe I did make a mistake. Maybe I had to raise the flaps to go through de-icing, anti-icing, and then I forgot to lower them again. Well, it turns out the trigger step is the takeoff, and I think there's only 4 things that can kill me on a takeoff: engine, the system, the configuration, and the controls. So I can check all 4 of those things in about 10 seconds, and I know I will not die during takeoff if I have a good engine, the configuration is set, the system is working, and the controls are free and clear. Same thing, last example, same example. So now put yourself 250,000 miles away, you're all alone, you got 2 crew members and you, 4 billion people on the other side, and you must do this burn without fail, and there's no one to help you. You've gone through the checklist, but what if you made a mistake? How do you deal with that? Well, you recognize this is important. It's a trigger step. There are only 4 things that matter on a burn: propellant, ignition, steering, timing. I can check all 4 of those in about 10 seconds. You do not make a mistake, and the burn will succeed. Hopefully that helps. Go back to your workforce. There will be times when they must concentrate, and if they understand the principles-based techniques of operating excellence, what's important, then they will not die, but they'll also be performing at peak effectiveness, and will actually increase productivity in your companies if they're following a certain set of principles-based techniques. I'll skip the last 2 stories, and Josh, I'll ask you to go to slide 39, last slide, and then we can have dinner. And it's just a picture of the book that I wrote that has all 30 of the techniques with more stories and examples. If you go to that website, I'll send you an autographed copy, or you can just get it on Amazon, but then it's not autographed. This is a picture of my granddaughter at 2 months of age, 2 months old, and my daughter sent me that picture and put the little quote on it. I wish I knew then what I know now. So she's reading the safety book, and we just thought it was a cool picture. Hopefully it helps. Thank you very much for being here. Go back to your workers and keep saving lives and increase productivity in your companies.